Thank you, Scott, very much. And thank you all for being here on a Saturday night. I'm quite honored. I'm also looking at 3 pictures of myself, and I don't know how to deal with it. But if you can turn them off, that'd be great. I have to say, I'm excited to be up here this weekend from the U.S., where life has been pretty uninteresting this week. And I want to express my profound gratitude to the University of British Columbia for expediting my application for asylum. And thank you. And I understand to the city of Vancouver for the housing subsidy that will make it possible for me to live here. And to Peter Nemitz for his kind offer to adopt me. That said. So it's past my bedtime in Boston. So let me get right to the subject at hand. I'm supposed to talk about how we missed the sexual abuse story for so long. Now, in 2003, we won the Pulitzer Prize for public service because we did not miss the story. In 2015, there was this film, Spotlight, about how we got the story. And I'm here to talk about how we screwed it up. Good luck with that. I'm kidding, of course. We did agree, and we thought it was a great idea, that this was a subject worth chewing over, not just how we stumbled upon the story, but how it is that a scandal of such enormous proportions, with the lifelong devastation it brought to countless thousands of children, went undetected for so long. At least in hindsight, some of the clues were hiding in plain view. Misery loves company. So let me plant this seed at the outset. Every Catholic archdiocese has something in common. Each is within a few miles of a major newspaper. So we all missed clues because this epidemic within the Catholic Church knew no boundaries, neither state lines or national borders. What was going on in Boston was going on everywhere, including, I assume, Vancouver. In the film Spotlight, the actor Stanley Tucci plays an irascible Boston lawyer who represents 84 clients who were all abused by a single priest, John Gagan. In one scene, Tucci says to Mark Ruffalo, who portrays my colleague Mike Resendez, "If it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a village to abuse a child." I'd like not to believe that, but I know it to be true. What we stumbled upon in 2001 has worn on me and a lot of other people, certainly a lot of Catholics, for all of the years since. I've been at the Boston Globe since 1972. I have covered countless unpleasant stories, including 1.5 wars. And yet I have never come across anything quite like this, where the crimes were so commonplace and so heinous, where the gulf between good and evil was so wide and so evident. And the evil rests squarely with the Catholic Church, the most iconic institution for 1.2 billion people around the world. The church in which many of us were baptized, confirmed, and married. The church I once assumed would bury me. For about 20 months between 2001 and 2003, we interviewed hundreds upon hundreds of survivors of clergy sexual abuse. The film concludes with a scene in which the phones are ringing off the hook. The day we published our very first story. That deluge of phone calls that began then were almost all victims. Over the next several weeks, we interviewed more than 300 victims just in the Boston Archdiocese. Our stories quickly went viral. It was the dawn of the internet age. And we were getting emails from across the US and around the world. And within a day or two of our first story, even from Australia, from victims of priests. Since the movie Spotlight made its debut a year ago this month, my colleagues and I have talked to many additional victims as more and more emerge from the shadows. The calls and emails have come from everywhere, including emails from victims of priests in South Africa, Italy, even India, where Catholics are a tiny percentage of the population. But the call I remember most, and always will, came in 2002 from Millinocket, Maine. The caller choked up as he related how his parish priest had raped him and that he had lived under a cloud ever since. I was the first person he had ever told. He had never told his parents, or his siblings, or his wife, or his children, or his grandchildren, or his great-grandchildren. This victim was 87 years old, and the rape had occurred 75 years earlier in 1927. We were getting so many calls every day, especially about priests in Boston, that I never wrote about the man from Millinocket. I pray that he has, at long last, found peace. You might fairly ask, how did the church get away with it for so long? How long? Decades, for certain, we know that. Centuries? Who knows? And to what extent did we miss signals, and how obvious were they? To this day, I cannot answer those questions with any certainty. In Boston, even at the Globe, there is little in the way of consensus. It is the one area where I find myself at odds with Tom McCarthy, the director of Spotlight, and screenwriter Josh Singer, who shared the Oscar for the Best Original Screenplay. They are entitled to their own conclusion since they spent a good 2 years investigating the Globe's investigation. They believe that at the paper's highest levels, above my pay grade, there was a reluctance to push the church on this issue. My view is more benign. It was akin to most stories that we miss in the news business. Ours are usually sins of omission, not commission. First, the Boston Globe was far from the first news organization to report in detail about the sexual abuse of children by Catholic priests. The first major story I am aware of was in the mid-1980s in New Orleans. It involved a pedophile, Father Gilbert Goethe, who had many victims. The reporter Jason Berry wrote extensively about this. There were other cases too, one in Dallas in the 1990s in which there was clearly a cover-up by that archdiocese. We had our own case to cover in 1992. It involved a priest in the Fall River Diocese south of Boston, Father James Porter, who had more than 100 victims. For anyone who thinks the Globe looked the other way on this issue, we covered the Porter case so aggressively that Boston Cardinal Bernard Law issued an intemperate public statement. He called down the power of God on the media, and especially the Globe. That's a direct quote. I call down the power of God on the media, and especially the Globe. There was some morbid humor about this in our newsroom because a week later, our editor, Jack Driscoll, a good Catholic, broke his leg and became seriously ill when he developed an infection. These cases that I mentioned all had something in common. They were isolated. Each involved a single priest. And a key factor, they all occurred in the pre-internet age, and so they received scant attention in the national media. The Globe, for instance, on the case in New Orleans in the mid-1980s, ran only one Associated Press wire brief, 275 words about that case. It's the only thing the Globe ever reported about it. And in all of these cases, the local bishop, archbishop, or cardinal described the offenders as single aberrant priests. And they claimed that Catholic priests did not abuse children at any greater rate than Methodist ministers or Lutheran priests. Those claims back then went pretty much unchallenged. I'd like to take you for a tour of the Globe newsroom and give you a glimpse of how we, like other papers, covered some stories while missing others every day. I returned to the newsroom in 1992 after 16 years at outside bureaus, including 8 years as a Washington reporter and foreign correspondent. I came back as city editor. Think of Lou Grant without the paunch. At a time when the Globe had all the money in the world and a staff big enough to spend much of it, much of the money. We had 550 journalists, including more than 80 reporters and editors on the Metro staff. But even back then, with all those resources, like most news organizations, we missed stories. Boston, like Vancouver, is a big city. There's a lot going on every day. So every day in our chaotic newsroom, and chaotic newsroom is a redundancy in the news business, the phones rang incessantly, calls from people, organizations, politicians, businesses, all of them wanting stories told. All day long, the fax machines, remember them? The fax machines spit out press releases. Reporters and editors' email inboxes filled up with alerts about allegedly important news events. On any given day, we published between 30 and 40 news stories, local news stories. If we had more staff and a bigger news hole, we could have published 80 or 100 stories a day. I like to think we were able to identify the most important of these stories, and most of the time we did, but not always. Very often, then and now, people who call newspapers to tell us about one injustice or another sound like they are off their meds. Much of the time, they are. But when you have been run over by the system, when you are a leading indicator of a major scandal, you can sound a little bit nutty. Remember the old saying, just because I'm paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get me. So let me mention the film again. There is a scene nearly identical to what happened in real life where we met with a survivor of sexual abuse, Phil Saviano. Phil gave us a lot of leads. Phil had approached the Globe 5 years earlier with the same information, and no one took him seriously. That's true. That happened. Phil was trying to tell them that the cardinal was involved in an international criminal conspiracy. It turns out he actually was. He was treated, Phil, as just another guy who was off his meds. There's another scene in the film near the end in which Michael Keaton discloses, playing me, discloses that the Globe ran a story inside the paper in 1993 based on a press release from a Boston lawyer. he claimed that he had received allegations about 20 different priests in the Boston Archdiocese. And that story ran inside the Metro section. Not on the front of the Metro section, not on page 1. Now, in real life, that scene didn't happen. But the basic facts are true. I'm asked about this pretty much every time I talk about this issue. The answer is a bit complicated. If you saw the film, you'll recall that the Globe Library brought us all of those clippings at the beginning of the film when we started to do our investigation. Any story that had ever been written, published about sexual abuse by priests. But we never got that 1993 clipping. It never showed up because when you snip stories out of the paper every day, they often don't get filed in the right places. But in 2012, long after the Globe archive had been digitized and made searchable, Josh Singer, the screenwriter, found that 1993 story. So Josh emailed me the clip. I had no recollection of that story, and probably wouldn't have had even if I had been shown it in 2001. But I mentioned to Josh that the story ran within a week or two after I was promoted to Metro editor. I wish I'd kept my mouth shut. But the fact is that story did run technically on my watch. So it became a scene in the film. And I think probably justifiably to make the point that they were trying to make. The same story also ran deep inside the other paper in Boston, the Herald. So the scene was created, and I like to think that Michael is playing two roles in the film, portraying me, of course, but also in that scene, a stand-in for a generation of Globe editors who were too deferential to the church. And that was surely true, though not just at the Globe. At pretty much every paper in every city, the local cardinal archbishop was treated with kid gloves. In Boston, which is the most Catholic of the major archdioceses in the U.S., it's fair to say that the cardinal archbishop was long the most powerful unelected politician in Massachusetts. Because of the malignancy we exposed in 2002, that's no longer true. In 2003, the Massachusetts Attorney General issued a report after a grand jury inquiry. He found that nearly 250 priests in the Boston Archdiocese had sexually molested children over a 60-year period. That is, keep in mind you're hearing this from a journalist, and journalists aren't very good at math, that is 10.75% of all the priests who served in Boston in those 60 years. I'd like you to think about those numbers for a moment. Boston is the archdiocese where there has been the fullest accounting of the extent of the abuse. Believe me, there is nothing in the water in Boston that made priests any more likely to molest children than, say, in Seattle or Denver or New York. Just this year, another grand jury in a small diocese in Pennsylvania, the Johnstown-Altoona Diocese, reported that 9% of priests there abused children. And there are a couple of other dioceses in the U.S. where grand juries have gotten a hold of all of the church's files, and the percentage of priests in those dioceses who abuse children is also in the 9 to 10% range. The National Conference of Catholic Bishops, after its own review, says that 4% of priests were credibly accused. I would invite you to consider the possibility that the church has understated the extent of the problem. perhaps by half. But whether it was 4% or 6% or 8% or 10.75%, how did the church manage to cover up so many crimes by so many priests against so many children for so long? That's the question the Spotlight team unearthed the answers to in 2001 and 2002. And we never would have asked those questions had not Marty Barron arrived from Miami, from the Herald, to become the Globe editor in July of 2001. Marty was the first outsider to be editor of the Globe. This says something for a pair of fresh eyes. He arrived in Boston with literal baggage, but no figurative baggage. He knew little about the city and didn't even like baseball. And he had no allegiances, but for one, to his conviction that a newspaper's primary mission is to hold powerful people and institutions accountable. With Marty, no one gets a free pass, as the Cardinal learned. Serendipitously, the day before he started work, Marty read a Sunday column by Eileen McNamara about a case that had been in and out of the news in Boston since 1996. It was yet another case of a single priest accused of sexual misconduct. But this one was different. Father John Geoghegan was a pedophile and was accused in civil lawsuits of molesting 84 children in 6 parishes over 30 years. Garabedian, the lawyer for the victims, claimed the archdiocese knew for all those years that what Geoghegan had done and simply transferred him from parish to parish. The church denied any such knowledge, and the church's records on Geoghegan, which had been turned over to Garabedian in discovery in the lawsuits, had been ordered to be kept under seal by the trial judge. At his first news meeting the next morning, Marty asked what steps the Globe had taken to get those records unsealed. He was greeted with silence. No one had thought to do so. This was Massachusetts. Judges sealed records. Why would we raise an eyebrow? By that afternoon, Marty had contacted the Globe's outside counsel, the first step in filing a motion arguing that the public had a right to know what was in the documents. The same day, Marty invited me and Ben Bradley Jr., who was my supervisor, into his office. He asked me to have my team investigate the Geoghegan case to find out what the Chancery knew over the years about Geoghegan's serial molestations. I don't know about you, but when a new boss asks me to jump, I say, how high? But I was a little taken aback. The Spotlight team, which was formed in 1970, had long feasted on the misdeeds and corrupt practices of politicians. In Massachusetts, there is never a shortage of such stories. Unlike Vancouver, I'm sure. But the Catholic Church, now that was an unorthodox, bold, and risky undertaking. This was a subject about which we on the Spotlight team knew nothing. Out of fear of the new editor, we took the vacuum cleaner approach. Instead of just making calls about Geoghegan, we began making contact with anyone we could identify who knew anything about the sexual abuse of children in Boston. And then we got lucky. Just a few days into our reporting on Father Geoghegan, we were told by one lawyer that Geoghegan was the tip of a large iceberg, that the church had secretly settled cases involving some large number of priests. The lawyer called the settlements hush money. We told Marty. He gave us the green light to go after the system. At that time, in August 2001, we thought, oh my God, what if this is 10 or 12 priests? What an extraordinary scandal that would be. By the Friday before 9/11, not 6 weeks into our investigation, we already had a list of more than 30 priests. The film compresses 5 months of our work into 2 hours and 8 minutes, which, believe me, is the only reason our reporting comes across as exciting. Edge of your seat drama, reporting, no. In real life, it was pretty tedious work, though the resulting stories that investigative reporters do can often be pretty riveting. There is one sequence of scenes in the film, about 2.5 minutes long, depicting how we took 20 years of the archdiocesan annual directories and poured through them to create our own database of likely predator priests. There were 87 of them in that spreadsheet we created. This was 2001, and it was my first spreadsheet. In real life, that 2-minute and 2.5-minute scene, the work actually took us 3.5 weeks. By January of '02, when we were set to publish our first story, we knew there were already over 100 priests involved. But it was the tens of thousands of pages of documents and all the interviews we did after the first story broke that laid out in detail the mechanics of the cover-up. For decades, Cardinal Law and his predecessors had routinely transferred priests whose sexual misconduct prompted complaints to new parishes where everyone was clueless, including often the new pastor. Starting in the 1970s, some priests were sent for treatment and then immediately sent off to new assignments as if all they'd had was a common cold. There was also a lend-lease program. Cardinals and archbishops around the country would take particularly egregious offenders and send them to other dioceses. It worked like this. Here, you take one of my bad guys, I'll take one of yours. Cardinal Law made the mistake of sending one bad actor to be chaplain of a Veterans Administration hospital in Seattle. The mistake? Law signed a document under oath attesting to the priest's good character. 2 years after Law resigned in disgrace and went into luxurious exile in Rome, a federal grand jury determined that he had perjured himself. But the Justice Department in 2004 decided not to prosecute. They should have. Surely what kept the press and public in the dark was the way the church handled complaints from victims and their lawyers. Through the 1980s and 1990s, the vast bulk of the formal complaints were not filed as public lawsuits. The courts were bypassed for 2 reasons. First, the church's overriding impulse, outlined in great detail in its own documents, was to, quote, protect the reputation of the church, to keep the abuse a secret, or, if I can phrase it infelicitously, to cover it up. And if the lawyers were willing to bypass the courts for private mediation, the Archdiocese was grateful enough to make larger settlements. Of course, those settlements included confidentiality agreements. There was no record of the complaint, and no one, including the lawyers, could talk about it. Surely, we thought, and then we were told, some cases must have been filed in court. Lawyers had told us so. But damned if we could find any. So we collected from the courts every docket number, every case, for every lawyer we knew who had ever been involved in a sexual abuse case. That was 1,500 cases we had to go through. We searched them one by one on the court system's outdated, even then, database. We didn't find any sexual abuse lawsuits, but in a substantial number of cases, several dozen, the only information online was a one-sentence notation, quote, "No information available about this case." So we went to the courthouses and we asked for those case files. And we discovered that we couldn't get them because they had been impounded by judicial order. Now in Massachusetts, a judge must hold a public hearing before he can impound any case file, because once you impound it, it's as if the case never existed. So we asked for the records of the hearings. There were none. None had ever been held. So our lawyer went to court and quickly got a court order lifting all the impoundment orders. No surprise. All the impounded cases were sexual abuse lawsuits against priests. All had been settled. In every case, the church lawyers moved to have the cases impounded on the grounds that sealing forever all records of the cases would protect the victims. The lawyers for the victims, who received a third or more of the settlements, didn't object. And the judges, many of them Catholics, went along. This came as no surprise to us. By then, we already knew that incriminating files in the Gagan case had mysteriously vanished from the Boston courthouse. The church's influence was apparent everywhere. Indeed, we learned in 2002 that there had been legislation filed every year for more than a decade to include clergymen among so-called mandated reporters. Under that law, which pretty much every state has, and I assume you have it here, mandated reporters have to report suspected cases of child abuse or neglect. If they do not, they themselves face criminal sanctions. Mandated reporters generally are doctors, nurses, teachers, social workers, professionals who work with children. The legislation to add clergymen was supported every year by the Massachusetts Protestant Ministers' Council and by the Jewish rabbis. And every year, the Cardinals' lobbyists made sure it died in committee. In early 2002, just after we pried the top off Pandora's box, the legislature quickly passed that bill, and the governor signed it into law. Of course, had it been enforced during the 1990s, Cardinal Law and several of his subordinates would have been criminally liable. The church's influence also infected law enforcement, where police and prosecutors were predominantly Catholic. Many times, we discovered, police and prosecutors knew what priests had done to children, and they looked the other way. The first scene in the film, at the police station, is a composite of a large number of cases we uncovered in which police did nothing or prosecutors broomed cases. When Gagan was assigned to one suburban parish in the mid-1970s, two parents complained to police that he had fondled their son's genitals. So the police chief, met with the judge and the prosecutor at the nearby district court. What to do? They called Bishop Thomas Daly, the first assistant to the cardinal, then Cardinal Medeiros, and they called him with an ultimatum: get Gagan out of town by sunset or we'll arrest him. Daly drove to the rectory, collected Gagan, and drove him to his new assignment at an inner-city Boston parish. During his 3 years there, Gagan abused many more small children. His victims included 7 children in one extended family. One of them was only 4 years old. In another case, a judge gave a priest in 1984 just 6 months probation for the anal rape of an altar boy. And the transaction happened in a way designed to keep it out of public view. The grand jury indicted Father Eugene O'Sullivan. That meant he had to be taken into custody, handcuffed, brought into Superior Court for arraignment. That's where the accused pleads not guilty, bail is set, and the first pretrial hearing is scheduled. But that's not what went down. First off, the arresting officer refused to cuff O'Sullivan because he was a priest. And when he walked into court with his church lawyer and the judge asked O'Sullivan how he wanted to plead, his attorney said his client would plead guilty on the spot, waived his rights, because the church wanted the case resolved without anyone finding out, and no one did. Along with the 6-month probation, the judge ordered O'Sullivan to remain within the archdiocese. A month later, Cardinal Law invoked the Lend-Lease Act again and sent O'Sullivan away to a diocese in New Jersey, where he worked in 4 parishes over 7 years, and only one of his 4 pastors knew about his conviction in Boston. Only God knows how many more children were placed in jeopardy. Of course, other priests knew or suspected, but they remained silent. Most of them had secrets of their own. In surveys, well over half of Catholic priests admit to violating their vows of celibacy and having consensual relations with other adult men and women. So when it comes to looking the other way, most everyone in the priesthood has a reason to do so. When my colleague Sasha Pfeiffer interviewed a retired pastor whose parish was one that Gagan was shuttled to, he told her, well, the word was around that Jack Gagan, liked to fool around with little boys and girls. In 2002, we wrote a book about this called Betrayal, Crisis in the Catholic Church. In the chapter on victims, I wrote about the case of Peter Pollard, a teenage victim of a priest in Marblehead, and recounted an incident early on Easter Sunday morning after midnight mass, in which Peter Pollard, then 16, was in the midst of a sexual encounter with the priest in the church basement. And the Monsignor walked in on them, saw what they were doing, turned around and started to walk out and said, "Turn out the light when you're done." The church, in its long-running effort to keep the extent of the abuse a secret, had every confidence that many who did know would never talk. And that would be the victims. First off, those who had filed claims were bound by confidentiality agreements. They were not permitted to tell anyone what had happened. But the vast majority of victims had never come forward. Actually, I think the vast majority have yet to come forward. But certainly the vast majority who've come forward in the last few years had not. They had never filed claims. But when the dam burst and they called us by the hundreds, we confirmed what we had long suspected from the interviews we had done already. The vast majority of them had suffered in silence, often for years. By our estimate, well over half of the victims had never told anyone of the abuse. We were the first people they had ever talked to about it. They felt shame and guilt over what was almost always their first experience with sex of any kind. They blamed themselves. Some told their parents and were disbelieved. Very few of the victims had told their siblings or even their spouses. Most often, they thought they were the only person this had ever happened to. But when they learned they were among the thousands, many of them clamored to speak out, to tell their stories, to cast aside the stigma they'd borne for years or decades. And in almost every case, their overriding motivation was not to get even, not to sue and win settlements, not even to get the long overdue counseling that so many of them needed. For them, speaking out became, they thought, they hoped, a guarantee that many other children would not suffer the same fate. There is a small scene in the film where Michael Keaton meets a fellow graduate of our Jesuit high school in a Providence coffee shop, where Michael asks him about a Jesuit who raped him. In real life, I met with Jim Scanlon in his office at the financial counseling firm he ran in Providence. The door was closed. Jim told me what had happened. He broke down in tears. So did I. Jim had never told anyone what had happened, and that night went home and told his wife. He didn't want his name used then, but not long after that, he thought he had a responsibility to do something, and he called the district attorney in Boston. Because of his testimony before a grand jury, Father James Talbot went to prison for 6 years, and the Jesuits now have Talbot safely locked away in their retirement home. Starting in 2002, the plaudits started flowing our way for the reporting we did. Fair enough. Then came the film. And ever since then, the Spotlight team from 2001 has been hoisted onto a pedestal as if we accomplished something that other reporters can't do. The truth lies elsewhere. Every time I speak before an audience with only a smattering of journalists, I know for a certainty that I am not the best reporter in the room. I am only the luckiest reporter in the room. There are few films about journalism in which reporters are cast as heroes. And that's how it should be, because in real life, we aren't. There's no danger, really, in what we do, though there is for reporters in other countries. Our work is made possible by people with real courage, who take risks when they give us information we need for our most important stories. So the only heroes in Spotlight, movie or real life, are the victims, like Jim Scanlon and the man from Millinocket, and so many others. Without their decisions to step out of the dark and tell their stories, we would not have had much of a story to publish. Thank you. I can't believe I got through that while looking at 3 pictures of myself in front of me all that time. But
they're good pictures. Just quickly, the guidelines for the question period, which he's graciously agreed to handle. This room eats sound, so please try to speak up. And he will handle this, and it's a kind of a catch-as-catch-can, and he'll repeat the relevant part of the question and answer, and we've got decent time, so we can certainly go for 15 minutes or so. And I throw it back then to you, Officer.
You know, however long you want to stay, I don't have to leave for the airport till 6 in the morning, so. If I can hear your questions, I'll repeat them, so to up the chances, we'll start in the first row.
Thank you. CBC write-up this morning said that you might also speak a little bit about the election.
What can I say? I mean, my experience so far is that people in Canada have a better idea of what happened than we do. What would you like? What?
Is the First Amendment in any danger?
You know, it's almost as if I planted that question with you. I was saying I had an email yesterday from a media lawyer friend of mine. He was at a conference, and somebody said, the First Amendment is in greater danger than any time since the Obama administration. Which I should add, the Obama administration used the Espionage Act to go after whistleblowers and reporters. So is the First Amendment in any danger? You know, Trump has, I mean, I don't mean to be facetious about it, but he has such a hunger for attention that he may end up having the most transparent White House ever. I hate that. But the fact, I mean, he made it clear during the campaign that he thought the libel laws should be changed so people like him, i.e. a public figure, have a better chance of collecting damages. He's unaware, or seemed to be unaware, not only that we have a First Amendment, but that we have precedential a case, New York Times v. Sullivan, which kind of gives us the right to be wrong when we write about public figures, you know, unless we're making it up. So he clearly, I think most of us are more worried about his, shall we say, learning curve issues on other matters than on reporters. And look, reporters are very conflicted about this because as much as they may be horrified personally by what the voters have done, they also realize that this is the most extraordinary story that they'll ever cover, no matter where it leads. Anyway, I didn't know if I answered that question. All right. I'm sure I'll get more. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to know, have only Catholics been involved in this kind of thing? How about other religions, pastors, rabbis, what have you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm sorry, the question is this only Catholic priests? What about rabbis and ministers and that, and Boy Scout leaders? And yes, this is a problem that's far too common in professions that deal with children. The Globe, our investigative team in the last year, has done a whole new series on private independent boarding schools in Massachusetts and other states in New England where children were routinely sexually abused over the decades. So that's another scandal. And you see, I think the Boy Scouts have had their problem, but the percentage of shall we say caregivers at other religious institutions who do this is a fraction, no matter what the Catholic Church says. It's a fraction of what went on in the Catholic Church. I think.
Do you mind turning to your right occasionally?
Are you suggesting I'm a leftist? Where did that question come from?
I wonder if you've read a book by Jeffrey Robertson, Queen's Counsel, called The Case of the Pope.
No. But if it's a quick read, I'll do it.
He's a very well-known lawyer, and he goes through it and goes through the whole thing and shows how incredibly abused these people were, and he talked about them being bewitched, buggered, and bewildered.
Okay, I haven't read it, but I'll.
It's a very good book.
One thing I should say, and many of you may know this, what Cardinal Law was doing in Boston was kind of a common strategy throughout the church. Saint John Paul II, now saint, former pope, the late pope, when he was Archbishop of Warsaw, he did the same thing. He moved priests around from one parish to another when they were caught abusing kids. Pope Benedict, when he was the Archbishop of Munich, did the same thing. And the current Pope, Pope Francis, when he was the Archbishop in Buenos Aires, claimed in 2002 that no priests in his archdiocese had ever abused children. And because it's a country where the church and the state are so close, there's been almost no investigation. Yes, sir.
There is a possibility that some priests of honorable intentions who would have spoken up were simply shut up by having somebody go to confession to them. And they were silenced by the secrecy of the confessional.
I believe, and I actually read something about this recently, but I'm so old I've forgotten most of it, that there is an exemption in the confessional if someone goes in and says, I murdered someone. I may be wrong on that, but there is one case in Boston we wrote about where one of the bishops wrote a letter to the cardinal, which we obtained, saying, we got to get this guy Gagan out of this parish because he's abusing young boys. We got to get him out of there. And for having the temerity to challenge the cardinal, he ended up as the bishop of Fort Wayne, Indiana. So, I don't know. Yes, ma'am?
When you actually did your spreadsheet listing the different individuals and that, did you correlate to see if they knew each other or if they had, what do you call it, been together in a region? Or?
What we were looking for, we knew of a certain number of priests, and we knew that their assignment patterns were that they got transferred very frequently, and that between assignments they ended up in these weird categories: awaiting assignment, sick leave, assigned to the clergy personnel office. This is because the church is losing priests left and right, they need every hand on deck. So this was suspicious, and so we decided to go through all of the directories for all of the years and find priests in this pattern. That's how we came up with the 87 names. And then when the victims started to call en masse, about 90% of those priests turned out to be predators. And I'm sorry I didn't repeat the question. Did you hear that? Okay. Ma'am?
What's happening in Boston now? What's been the fallout? Is it still Catholic?
Is the question is what's happened in Boston? What's the fallout? Is it still Catholic? The part of the fallout is the church has lost virtually all of its political clout. I would tell you that Massachusetts, one of the bright lights of this election, Massachusetts legalized marijuana use at a time when we may all need to get high for the next 4 years. And the church, the archdiocese, spent $800,000 on an advertising campaign to defeat it. Now, look, the church has suffered. It's cost them an enormous amount of money to settle cases. They've had to sell off lots of property, including the mansion the cardinals used to live in. Mass attendance is down. There are supposedly 2 million Catholics out of the 4 million people who live within the boundaries of the archdiocese. I don't think 15% of them go to church regularly. But the church has lost a lot of its standing in the community because of what happened. In the back, that's you.
So as a journalist, what is your ethical responsibility towards victims?
As a journalist, what is our ethical responsibility toward victims? That's a good question, and one that we wrestle with. Ordinarily, when you're doing an important story and someone speaks to you and tells you something, your impulse, which is usually correct, is to get it in the paper. But we had an obligation in this case not to put, if we could avoid it, not to put victims in harm's way. First of all, like most news organizations, we have a policy: we do not identify victims of sexual abuse or sexual assault unless they agree to have their names used. And so we were very careful about that. There were times when people called us and told us they wanted their names in the paper, and we actually talked them out of it. So it's like any story of that kind. You have discussions. It happens more frequently than you would think in a newsroom, where you talk over, well, the public may have a right to know this, but do they have a need to know it? I mean, there's lots of things we find out that we don't put in the paper for that reason. And is the potential damage to a victim worth the chance of putting their name in the paper? So those discussions are held a lot, and they certainly were in, as we dealt with this case. Yes, sir, right there.
Yeah, two questions. Is as a result of your reporting for this, for these priests, how many ended up being convicted? And in the credits at the end of the movie, is it true that the Archbishop Cardinal got, since he oversaw this and knew all the stuff that was going on for so many years, but it sounded like he was promoted and he got a bigger job in Rome. Is that all true?
On your first question, the number of priests who actually were convicted and went to jail, I think it was in the neighborhood of about 20. And the reason for that is in the vast majority of these cases, the criminal statute of limitations had long since run out. In most states, that statute has been lengthened now. But some of them got tripped up, and this was something I was not aware of before we started on this. If the statute of limitations was 5 years, if a priest abused somebody in 1980 and then moved to Maine, as Father Talbot did, the statute of limitations stopped ticking. And he came back to Massachusetts in 1999, and there was still 3 years to run on the statute. So they were able to indict him. And that's a common thing. So to your other question, did Law get promoted? He was the senior, most influential American cardinal. He was given this cushy job as the pastor of one of the major basilicas in Rome with a cook and 10,000 euros a month allowance. Now, that would sound like to many of us a promotion, and I think most people think, it wasn't punishment, that's for sure. But he lost, I'm sure he would consider he lost everything that was important to him. So promotion, he's now retired from the College of Cardinals. He's 84 and he's quite ill, and he lives in a 2-room apartment in the Vatican. So that's where he is. Yes?
Answer if you're willing, but you mentioned being a Catholic previously. What's been the personal fallout for you as a result of this journey?
Did I mention that I was a Catholic? The question is, was I a Catholic, and what's happened to me as a result of this journey? I guess I did mention that I was. Look, one thing, I thought I knew my team members. I had picked them all, but one thing we discovered when we started to work on this story, that we all had been raised Catholic. And we were all lapsed. Or as Bill Keller wrote in the New York Times that year, he was a collapsed Catholic. And so it gave us, we understood the culture of the church, and perhaps myself more than my colleagues, because I had gone through 12 years of Catholic education. It was unsettling to us, it certainly was to me, because when you think about it, all of the values that were instilled in me as a child essentially came from my church, from this church. So that was a bit of a blow. I can't say, look, my wife now is an Episcopalian, partly because they've recognized the fact that women should have a role equal to men in this world. And I, you know, I don't often talk about this, but since, you know, nobody will know what was said here, I will not go inside a Catholic church unless it's for somebody's wedding or someone's funeral. And I have my faith, and I think like most Catholics who have abandoned the church because of this, you know, I think we've discovered you don't need the institution of the church to maintain your faith in God. Sir, in the orange sweater.
Is there in Massachusetts a separate school system with Catholic secular priests and nuns? And has this been a problem in that cohort?
Is there in Massachusetts a separate Catholic school system with priests and nuns, and has this been a problem? Most of the Catholic high schools, including my own alma mater, the Jesuit high school, have had problems, had priests who abused kids. But the fact of the matter is that Catholic education almost everywhere, the teaching staffs are all lay teachers nowadays. There just are, I mean, there are very few nuns, and the number of priests has dwindled so badly, partly because of the silly, I think, celibacy rule, which, by the way, I happen to think gave you an applicant pool that maybe wasn't as ideal as you would want to have in the priesthood, which might have exacerbated this problem. But if there's ever a priest in the audience and I say that, it starts an argument. Right in front of you, ma'am.
On your list of priests and that, what was the age? Did you look at the ages of the individuals involved and that? And the second one was, did you ever explore the culture of how the priests felt that they could get away with this and that? I mean, they would just get transferred. Was that something that was known among that group, or?
That's a good question. Oh, the first question, did we get a sense of the ages of the priests when they abused the children? It was a great range. I mean, some of them started in their late 20s, and some of them were abusing kids when they were in their 60s and 70s. So there was no way. There was a big spike up in incidents in the 60s and 70s. And the church at one point commissioned a study by John Jay College, which blamed that, believe it or not, on the sexual revolution. It's just a mystery to me. And the culture and how they got away with it, I think I mentioned that the bulk of all priests were violating their vow of celibacy. So there was a lot of, there was this culture of silence about sexual activity, which I think helped, even though other priests might have been aware of or suspected stuff going on. It was also, I'm amazed that I grew up in a parish, and I went back and checked every priest who had ever been assigned there. Not a one ever accused. And, you know, I felt like I won the lottery, because most parishes at one time and another had a priest. But I think there was a lot of denial going on. You know that river, denial. And people looked the other way. And I think the church, you know, overlaid on this was the fact that the church looked at this as these are sins, and sins are meant to be forgiven. It's not like they figured out that this is really a sickness, a serious illness. So, anyway, ma'am.
If anybody's interested, there's a book called The Bishop's Man by McIntyre, Linda McIntyre.
There's a book called The Bishop's Man by Linda McIntyre.
That is written about interesting book, which kind of brings out how it can happen, and people, thin out, don't see it.
Yeah.
It's very good.
Was it Lyndon McIntyre? Okay. Canadian journalist, okay. Okay. Yes, sir.
What steps has the church taken, if any, in a preventive mode, in terms of analyzing causation and stopping abuse?
What steps have the church taken, if any, to minimize, stop the abuse, and prevent it from happening in the future? The Catholic Church in America has been mostly pretty good, although there are incidents, a bishop every now and then gets caught covering up for another priest, so you wonder how committed some dioceses are. But generally speaking, first of all, and this is a really good thing, parents are much more vigilant now, not just in the context of Catholic schools, but generally. The church does training for everybody on signs to look for, when they have to report. They do criminal background checks on everybody. I don't know how much good that does. I mean, there are a lot of these priests who abuse kids who never get prosecuted. They're living out in the community now because the church threw them out. But I have to say, a lot of the reforms in the U.S. have essentially come at the point of a gun. Either, prosecutors demanding it, which one thing that happened in Massachusetts, or civil lawsuit settlements. And outside the United States, I don't know as much about Canada. I hope things have changed to the extent there were problems here. But in most countries in the world, nothing's changed. And Latin America is a great example of this, where the church and the state are very careful. I was in Brazil last month, and I had to figure out a polite way to say this, but Brazil is the most Catholic country in the world. They have 130 million Catholics. They have 18,000 priests, and they've only caught about 7 or 8. And so I said, Boston, and I got up, I said, Boston has 2 million Catholics, and they had 250 priests. You have 130 million Catholics, and you're only admitting to 7? How'd that happen? But around the world, it's not, and part of it is because the still reigning princes of the church were all pretty much involved in keeping this quiet. And I think it might take a new generation to change that, I fear.
How about just a couple more questions? We're approaching 9:30.
Approaching 9:30. Yes, up there.
How has this affected the way you look for stories and receive stories from sources?
How has it affected the way we look for stories? That's a really good question, because it did. I mean, the first thing we learned is we do our most revered institutions no favors by not holding them to the same scrutiny that we give to, say, political institutions. That they're run by human beings who are obviously fallible. That was the biggest lesson I think we all learned in the business. I mean, on stories, one thing it taught me, and we had, and I mentioned this, we had focused most of our attention on political corruption over the years, but after this, we started to look, it wasn't somebody dropping a dime about a politician. We realized that if we just went out and looked around us, we would find victimized populations, people who are being run over in one way or another by society, who have no voice but for the voice we give them. Because in most cases, government has failed them. So that changed for us. And some of the series that we did after we finished with the priests are a reflection of that change in attitude. The Globe right now is 4 parts through a humongous 6-part series on how the mental health care system in Massachusetts and other states is so abysmally bad, underfunded, neglected, so many people dying. this is a story that, we all kind of know about, but nobody's put it together. So that's how that's changed. And I'm sorry if I went on too long on that. Yes, ma'am.
What is your take on why the last pope resigned?
Why did the last pope resign? I think the last pope resigned for the same reason I fear the present pope may resign, and that is the College of Cardinals is pushing back. Pope Francis started out with a pretty obvious suggestion that the bishops and cardinals ought to get out of their limousines, and that hasn't actually worked very well. And even on the sexual abuse front, where he's tried to make some changes, he has this commission. He's got a couple of cardinals inside the Vatican who basically announced to a whole set of new archbishops that if they become aware of cases of sexual abuse, they don't have an obligation to report it to civil authorities. How did that happen? It happened because there are people in the College of Cardinals who don't want him to succeed, because he's a little more liberal. I think of him as, here we finally have someone who's trying to drag the church from the late 17th into the early 18th century. And too many people are saying, not going to happen. One last question, way up in the back, sir.
We've heard a lot about your accolades, your pats on the back. On the flip side, how has the backlash been? Have you or anyone on your spotlight team had to endure anything?
You mean like the church coming after us?
Yeah, someone on the street telling you to give up the Boston Bruins and go for the Vancouver Canucks.
Do we have a hockey team in Boston? Well, I can't remember any other story I've ever done. You leave some constituency really PO'd. And it just goes with the territory. This story, we expected to have protesters in front of the Globe. And it didn't happen. And what happened, and this is a great lesson for young journalists, you got to prove it. Anonymous sources don't work. We had the documents. And if we didn't, I don't think we could have published. This was a church. I mean, if you're going to take down the Catholic Church, you better have the goods. And I think people were just like so stunned, and they were sort of trying to absorb what was being reported day in and day out in those first few weeks. And after a week or so, they kind of realized, I guess we shouldn't blame the messenger here because it's the cardinal. And so we didn't get that. In fact, we got a lot of conservative Catholics who otherwise have no use for the Globe, except for maybe their coverage of the Bruins. We had conservative Catholics calling us up and thanking us because they had raised their children in the church, and they were so outraged that 3 cardinals in a row, at least 3, had put their children at risk. So, on that story, we kind of escaped pretty much unscathed.